Hey, party people. I am doing this voiceover in my car in sunny La Jolla. I'm still at the La Jolla International Fashion Film Festival, a completely impromptu, random trip I took last minute. And I'm like, well, I shot it. I just have to do the voiceover. And like, let's just take the laptop. Comic-Con is happening at the same time as the Fashion Film Festival, and all I really wanna do is dress up as Edna and run around Comic-Con giving people shit about having capes. So, I'm in the car, I probably look like a crazy person talking to myself because people can't really see my laptop unless they look really into my car, and then they're the creepy ones, right? So so today we're doing a basic fashion illustration using gouache. I'm using the Pabeo brand gouache today in burnt sienna and vermilion, and I'm using the set of Knicker brand gouache that I got in Japan that I have been enjoying a lot. And then I am also using crusty bits left over on my palette from whatever XYZ projects, because that's one of the great things about gouache is you just leave it in the palette and then you add water to revive it. Sometimes I use an eyedropper, sometimes I use a spray bottle if I'm trying to do a bunch of colors at once, but yeah, that's my one of my favorite things about gouache. I have a lot of favorite things about gouache, so yeah. And I am using Arches Hot Press 140-pound watercolor paper. So hot press is smooth typically, and it doesn't have that bumpy texture that cold press does. I like both papers depending on the project I'm working on, but today I'm using hot press because I'm not trying to emphasize texture. And those of you who are regulars to my channel know that when I use gouache, I use it as a watercolor in that I water it down a lot. And the reason why I use gouache instead of watercolor, if I water it down a lot, is I like to build up and really take advantage of the opacity that you can get with gouache, because I will build up layers so that things are darker, more opaque, and then sometimes I like to go in with a lighter color on top. Like if I were doing like light pink flowers on a brown background, I can do that with gouache because gouache can be opaque. And so because I can play with everything from transparent all the way to super opaque, that's why I prefer gouache to watercolor. I do have watercolors, but I always use them, like, I want to say 97% of the time I use them with my gouache for these kinds of illustrations. This is I don't know, I think this is like a 12, 13-inch figure, which is about as big as I get when I'm doing straight up like design communication work. Like I've done figures, like I've done charcoal drawings of figures where it's like almost life size. People have commissioned me to like do big drawings for like the interior of store boutiques or whatever. But for straight up fashion design communication, this is about as big as a figure as I get. And then, of course, like quick design croquis, they tend to be about 10 inches tall, whatever fits on a, letter size or A4 paper. That's the correct paper, right? A4 paper. That's the one Europeans use. That's like 11 to 12 inches long. I think so. I went to when I was young, super young, I was 19, 20. I did a summer program at St. Martin's, and on the supply list, they were like, please bring one pad A4 paper, one pad A2 paper. And I was like, huh? This is what I've done before the video. I had my croquis figure blown up to about 12 inches. I taped it to the back of my hot press watercolor paper. I used it as a template to draw out my figure. And with this kind of painting, this kind of illustration work, getting the drawing right is like most of the battle. If you have the drawing right, you're just basically coloring in as best you can after that. So practice the drawing. Like in retrospect, now that I'm looking at what I've done, I think I drew the top a little bit too stiff. Like I should have added a little bit more feel, a little bit more flow to it, like I did the skirt. But we're just going to go with it. So get the drawing down and try to erase as little as possible because you don't want to mess up the surface texture of your paper because that also affects your drawing. So there's that. So we've got the drawing done. And right now I'm just testing all over my paper because this is just a demo and I don't care. It's not a final project. But you definitely want to have a scrap piece of paper that is the same paper, same kind of paper you're using for your illustration to test colors. Okay? Have you guys heard that saying, measure twice, cut once? And how that saves a lot of work and a lot of heartache? It's the same thing is true with painting and markering. I always have a scrap to just double check that color the last second before I lay it down on my paper, and it saves a lot of redo work. What is it that I say? The best eraser in the world is time travel. All right. So, just out of pure habit, I start with skin tone. So here's the thing is when I'm painting, as I was going to school and like doing I would turn in like junior year, I was turning in 6 to 8 of these a week. These like final finish gouache illustrations on heavy duty paper. And then senior year, I was turning in like anywhere from 8 to 12 of these a week for my illustration class. And you kind of like learn how to do things really quickly. And one of the things I do is I hardly ever have downtime, have dead time where I'm waiting for things to dry because I move around the paper. So I will paint the head, the neck, the chest, and then I'll skip over to the arm, and then I'll skip over to the stomach, skip over to the leg. And in that way, I'm letting other parts dry, but also I'm separating so that I'm not having these colors like flooding each other. Okay, because when you have like wet things next to wet things, they want to touch, they want to mingle, they want to do the lambada, and you don't want that to happen. You want to keep the color sections separate on your painting. And so that's why I dance around and let these sections dry before I go back up, and then I'll maybe do the hair later, but the face is dry already, so you're good to go, right? So that's kind of a workflow thing. Back when I was in school and even now when I do a bunch of these at once, I'll do a thing where I'll mix the skin tone. I'll do all the skin tone on all the figures. And then by the time I get to the first one, all the skin is dry. And then I can move on to the next thing. This is how I mix colors. So regulars on my channel know that when I'm shading, okay, I don't mix a new shading color. I know in color theory and in traditional painting and illustration, you create these shadow hues using complements and, working with the color of the light and I don't do any of that for fashion illustration, design communication work. Okay. Because again, I'm not really into like photorealistic work. And so what I do, I do a very simplified way of shading so that, my goal is to show off the design as much as possible and really I like to retain the color vibrancy and just kind of simplify things. So what I do is I mix, for example, this skin tone. Okay. I mix a dark skin tone, and it's typically like the darkest shadow color I will use in the illustration. And then I separate them out into different wells on my palette, as you can see on my palette with the skin tones. And then I add different quantities of water to each of the wells. So I have 3 different opacities for one color. And then I use those 3 colors for the skin. And sometimes when I'm doing something really elaborate, I'll have like 4, 5 wells. Or sometimes when I'm just working really simply and cleanly or something really quickly, I'll just have one shadow color. Even when I'm doing markers, I do the same thing where I just, if I'm doing a red, I'll just buy a red and then I'll buy a slightly darker red for my shadow color. It's just the simplest way to do things. And then I focus on shadow placement to create the 3D look. And I have a video called the three kinds of shadow. I have a playlist called General Illustration Basics where I talk about shadow placement, where I place the shadows. And in that series, I also talk about different blending and shading techniques with different media. So I'm not going to go into that too much in here. There's only so much I can cram into one video. But go check out those videos. I do have one that is there's one that's shading basics. So really going into where I'm putting the shadows. And then I have one on shading with watercolor, so that I'm giving you a little bit of like watercolor painting techniques on how to shade things. So I'm doing a rendering of hair, and I have an entire hair series on how to render hair. I have a specific video on how to render wavy and curly hair. So go check those out. Those videos are done in marker, but there's nothing different about doing hair with marker than with paint. It's just simply mixing the paint color, and that's pretty much it. But like where to put the highlights and how to address hair and how to do the different hairstyles, that's all in the hair series. And that playlist is called Hair because I really enjoy tricky, hard to understand playlist titles. Side note, I also have a playlist on how to draw faces, and that playlist is called Faces. Uh, so yeah, the only thing about hair that I can really think of to put is I tend to enjoy a slightly more opaque gouache when I render hair, because when you make gouache with less water, it ends up being a little dry looking, and you can see a little bit of the individual kind of bristles with the brush. But that really mimics the texture of hair. And so I enjoy that. I use that to my advantage so that if I get little baby wisps of paint, that just looks like individual strands and baby locks of hair, right? So I use that to my advantage. Okay. So yeah, normally I would not be painting upside down. It's just I don't want to like bend over my paper and block the camera. So because I need to get closer to look, so I'm just kind of turning it over a few times. Uh Here's a question I get a lot. Tips on how to illustrate very small faces. Students were like, Zoe, I could do a face. I can't do a tiny face. Tiny faces are hard. Tiny faces are hard, and you know what I'm going to say. You should go practice. Uh, Here are a few tips. Number one, practice on slightly bigger faces. Never practice on something huge like fist size, because we're hardly ever going to draw them fist size for most of us, And so don't practice in a size you're never going to need. Just practice a little bit bigger than that. And then as you practice progressively smaller and smaller and smaller. Number two, use a really skinny freaking pencil. 0.3 lead. The third and the best, most important thing about drawing small faces is working on your line quality so that you're drawing simple, clean shapes. And when you're constantly kind of like sketching hairy little lines and stuff, it's hard to do precise small shapes. You have to get in the practice of drawing long, clean lines so that when you're drawing small shapes, you can draw small, clean lines. And you're like, how to do that? You need to practice drawing shapes without resorting to little sketchy short lines. And in the beginning, I promise you, your shapes are going to be ugly, and that's okay. But you just have to keep practicing the long lines and the clean shapes until your shapes get more accurate. But you really need to push yourself to get that line quality, to get those long pencil lines. And that's how, you develop a beautiful line quality. That's how you're able to uh, have figures that don't look stiff and blocky. Okay, so really, you need to practice your line quality and working on getting shapes drawn with as few lines as possible. Painting order. So sometimes I start with the base color and just color the whole thing. Like I did with the skin tone, I chose the base skin color. I painted the whole thing. And then I went in with a slightly darker color, which is, a more opaque paint, and put in the shadows according to my 3 kinds of shadow method. And then I went in with, and this is optional, of course, but I went in with a third color, darker shadow color, and I put in the shadows for the darkest areas. And no, I didn't blend the 3 shadows together for this one. I do it sometimes. I don't even do it the majority of the time, blending all the shadow colors together. Um, just personal preference, and I don't need it all the time. I focus more on making sure the clothes look right, that the fabric looks right, than the skin color. If you're interested in learning how to blend and you're a beginner, I still recommend that you learn other basics because blending is a little bit more difficult. And, I'm all about learning how to walk before you run. Sometimes what I do is I paint the whole thing in a color slightly lighter than my base color, which is what I'm doing here. So I want to create a soft red, and I started by coloring the whole thing a slightly lighter red than my fabric color. And that's why I'm using this darker red to go in, and it looks like just have like giant shadows, like the whole thing is in shadow, but I'm not. I'm just leaving these kind of like soft highlights. They're not even real highlights because I'm not trying to express a shiny fabric. Just the softest of highlights. I mean, is there a word in English for that? Like barely highlights, just kind of like light touching the fabric, but not to express shine. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? So when I'm doing this kind of layering painting with shadows without blending, I make sure that the bottom layer, the last layer that I just painted, is about 90% dry before I move on. Okay, and add the second layer. And when I'm doing tricky textures and details where everything has to be super crisp and refined, I will wait until the last layer is 617% dry. But when it's something like this where it's a solid color and the shadow edges can be a little bit soft, even if they're not blended, they can be a little bit soft and whatnot, then 80 to 90% dry is fine. And then you add your shadow layer. Of course, now I have to take a break from adding shadow layers because there's so much water now. Like it's 2 layers of not dry paint. So yeah, I don't waste time. Now I move on to shoes. If she's carrying a bag, if I wanted an elaborate makeup look, I would start painting that. I hate dead time. My style of fashion illustration has always been about design communication, and as a designer, I like to work as quickly as possible. Which is not to say I rush through my work. There's a difference between that and like having a lot of dead time and, I'm enjoying the long painting process. I do not enjoy a long painting process where I hem and haw over decisions. Like I nail all the decisions in the quick sketch process, and then I take notes on what I want finessed in the final illustration, and then I'm a go. I'm a go, go, go. Okay. I have things to do. One of the nice things about gouache is you can lift it up a little bit afterwards. You're going to see me mess up in three, two, ooh. I really should have went in with a smaller brush, but I was just being, a lazy idiot. And so I went out a little bit. So what you want to do is take a clean brush, okay, and take like a tiny bit of water and just dab the water right on the area you want to lift. And then take your brush and then squeeze out the water so that it's dry-ish. And then try to lift up that little bit of paint that you've kind of re-wet and just kind of pick it up as gently as possible. You got to scrub a little bit, but try not to mess up the texture of the paper. And then you kind of do that over and over again until you've lifted as much as you can. And sometimes you have to repaint stuff underneath. Sometimes if you're gentle enough, the whatever was underneath is untouched. So luckily in this case, I didn't have to go back and repaint a bunch of skin, but I'm going back in with the skinny brush. I think it's a number 4 size round, and I'm going in with my darker shadow color. This is my third red. And again, all these reds are the same color base, but with different quantities of water mixed in to create the different values of the same red. Okay. Now I'm just going in, and with gathers, it's like, fabric shadow, fabric shadow, fabric shadow, fabric shadow, because the shadows, like the fabric folded in. So I'm putting in those shadows. And then with the drapes, it's like anytime the fabric goes in towards the body, it gets in the shadow. So in between the drapes that go in towards the body get the shadow. And then each outside shape, it's round. And so the side away from the light gets the shadow. So I'm putting those in. And again, I waited until the other layers were mostly dry before I went in with the shadow color, because I didn't want to do a wet on wet. I didn't want to do a soft blendy look. Those two looks are more difficult. I'm trying to show you kind of like a basic, beginner basics fashion illustration with watercolor or gouache. And everything I do here, you can do with just watercolor and not gouache. It's just you're not going to get some of this opacity, like these darkest reds. I'm getting this color intensity because there's so little water in my paint. And if you wanted something really dark red in watercolor, you most likely have to start mixing darker colors to your red. So at this stage, I stepped away from the illustration to let all the paint dry. And then I came back to visit. I'm adding just like a final touch of the darkest red. I'm going to go in and just put in the darkest shadows, like finishing touch shadows, just so that it looks nice. Just unnecessary, but it looks nice. And I made that mistake again, so now I'm just fixing that lip again. Story of my life. And I'm going to take a colored pencil. What am I using here? A black Prismacolor colored pencil. And I prefer it. Prismacolor, it's problematic sometimes because the two biggest complaints I hear about Prismacolor color pencils is number one, the wax bloom, and number two, the finicky nature of needing to sharpen. Like sharpening Prismacolors is a nightmare. But for me, one, I don't do large fills of colored pencils, so wax bloom is not a problem for me. It's not an issue I need to address. And number two, I got that amazing pencil sharpener that is just a dream, and I'll link it in the description box. So yeah, I have long loved Prismacolors, still do. So I think the color is more vibrant than the Faber-Castell Polychromos. That's a brand that I also love, but it's just the black is not as intense. And so when I want the intense, I'm going to go for the Prismacolor. When I do the initial drawing for the illustration, I use a 0.3, very skinny H lead, sometimes HB, but I try to keep the underdrawing as light as possible. For my video tutorials, I do tend to draw on the darker side so that I'm sure that the camera will pick it up so you guys will see, but often I'll draw even lighter than what you saw earlier today. And then I go in once all my paint is, 720% dry. I go in with a pencil or a dark colored pencil, depending on the look I'm going for, and punch out the initial drawing and go in with the details, draw in my pockets, draw in all that stuff. Like, for example, if this skirt had patch pockets that were a different color, I would draw in the pockets so that I knew to make the pockets a different color. If I have pockets in this dress that are the same color as the soft red, then I wouldn't bother drawing in the pockets until after the drawing was done. Because I don't want to smear a lot of lead around when I'm painting. And so that's kind of what determines what goes into the underdrawing. And then now I'm doing all the finishing work, punching out details, making sure that the details I want to express in the design, my favorite parts, are really emphasized in the final sketch. I like to take a little gel pen and drop a little highlight, ping, ping, in the eyes. Sometimes a little bit on the lip if I'm going for a glossy lip look. I really should have made the shadows on the legs bigger because the big skirt would create big cast shadows. What you gonna do? Reshoot the whole thing? Yeah, no. I'm still in a car in La Jolla hours before. Like, I have to still put my makeup on so I can go to the film festival morning session. All right, well, I hope this video was helpful and that you learned things to help you get started or improve your watercolor and gouache fashion illustrations. Please give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful or entertaining. Share, comment, subscribe, all those beautiful ways you show me love. Hashtag always be practicing. Hashtag practice, not magic, because we are not made of magic. We are made of practice. Hashtag if your first one sucks, you're right on track. Hashtag perfectionism is stupid. All the dumb hashtags, all the crazy hashtags, and I will see you in the next video.